Shalom. This is Ron Warren with the Nuggets of the Torah. This week's teaching is the 10th Parsha, and it's called Mikeitz, which is at the end. There is a reversal in this Parsha on two levels, the chronological level and the level of significance. It starts out with Joseph's life that Joseph was single. At the end of this Parsha, Joseph will be given a wife, Potiphar's daughter. It started out with the words used by Joseph was, "I dreamt a dream." And the words used by Pharaoh was, "a dream I dreamt" in Hebrew. It also talks about the brothers and Jacob explaining Joseph's two dreams to him. And Joseph is going to explain the two dreams to the Pharaoh. It also talks about Joseph being sent away by his father, which was his authority, and now Joseph is being brought before Pharaoh, which is an authority figure. It also talks about the brothers removing his cloak, and Joseph at the end is given new clothes. And it talks about Joseph being put in a pit, and now Joseph is being taken out of the pit, which in King James is using the word dungeon. And right at the very middle of that is God's waiting room of 13 years. It is written in Acts chapter 7, verse 9, that the patriarchs, moved with envy, sold Joseph into Egypt, but God was with him. You know, in agriculture, there's a season for planting, another for waiting, and another for harvesting. You cannot expect a seed to produce its harvest without its time and season. A foundation must be laid first. And here's an engineering point. When a foundation is laid, the height of the building is already determined. The best example is the Empire State Building. The total foundation is 55 feet below the ground. Now, if the foundation was off by 1/4 of an inch, the building would have collapsed when they were working on the 101st floor. The entire 102nd floor of the observatory would not have been built. Why is this important to us? It is important because of a proper solid foundation needs to be laid so that it can carry the weight of the blessings and the challenges that come. The deeper we lay our foundation in the Word of God, the higher the potential of the house that God can build in us. Very often, we are not ready for the blessings that God has for us, so that when they come, we don't see them and they pass over. What is God's waiting room? God's waiting rooms are places along our walk through life where God says, wait here. And what looks like 10 minutes turns out to be 10 months or even 10 years. No matter what people say, the believer does have a waiting room experience. Remember, he is building you into the image of his son, Yeshua. This waiting room experience is necessary. Why? Answer these questions. If you've never known pain, how would you know that God was a healer? If you never went through difficulty, how would you know that God is a deliverer? If you never had a trial, how would you know that God is the comforter? If you never made a mistake, how would you know that God is forgiving? If you were never in trouble, how would you know that God came to your rescue? If you were never broken, how would you know that God can make you whole? If you were never had a problem, how would you know that God can solve them? If you never had nothing or known suffering, then how would you know what Yeshua went through? If you never went through the fire, then how would you become pure? If God gave you all things, how would you appreciate them? If God never corrected you, how would you know he loves you? If you had all power, and then how would you learn to depend upon God? And if your life was perfect, then what would you need God for? You know, in this last week's and this week's Parsha, Joseph gets parked by God and is placed into his waiting room for 13 years. God's had two objectives for Joseph's life. His objective over our lives are no different. One, he was building Joseph's character and ours. Number two, he was testing Joseph's character and ours. This is the normal process that God utilizes with man or a woman that he wants to use. And the greater God's desired use, the more he invests in his character building curriculum. You must learn to wait on God. The prophet Isaiah said, "But they that wait upon the Lord shall renew their strength. They shall mount up with wings as eagles. They shall run and not be weary. They shall walk and not faint." You're going to find that in Isaiah 40, verse 31. Joseph was a genius. He had no equal in his generation. Pharaoh deemed Joseph wise and understanding. And generations later, centuries are going to pass, and lands apart, another person is going to appear. And the biblical expression wise and understanding was applied to one other person. That was King Solomon, as recorded in 1 Kings chapter 3, verse 12. Joseph wisely allowed Pharaoh to take the lead. In his advice to Pharaoh, the word "I" never left his mouth. He was unimportant and unnecessary, and he told Pharaoh what the dream meant. He told Pharaoh how to solve the crisis, and he withheld nothing from Pharaoh, including giving away his game plan to Pharaoh, to find an overseer for the job that will appoint commissioners to levy a store tax of 20% over the next 7 years of abundance to save during the coming 7 years of famine. Joseph was a wise and understanding man. The more he told, the more he was trusted. The more he spoke, the more God was glorified. And the more he humbled himself, the more others were blessed. He understood that God's wisdom at work in his life. God saw the unlimited potential in him, stuck with him for 13 years, and in the end slowly reintroduced him to the world. You know, in Ecclesiastes chapter 3, verse 1, it reads, "To everything there is a season, and a time for every purpose under the sun." Ask God to show you his purpose, plans, and path for your life. Shalom. Until next week with the nuggets of the Torah.